So hi everyone, I'm Jaroslav Stehlik, the creator of SVG Importer, and today I will show you how to use the SVG modifier inside SVG Importer. So basically, what is an SVG modifier? It's a script which allows us to modify the image in a specific way, like to change its shapes, or to change its to make some deformation and so on. So as you can see, I have opened the scene which is called SVG modifier demo, which is part of the SVG importer, and this one is called motion blur demo, and it's actually using the native anti-aliasing function. And as you can see, it's really exaggerated, so we will make it much more usable with changing the blur modifier. And because the blur modifier is already part of the asset, we can play with it, and as you can see, it's changing the blur amount based on the speed and our radius. So what or how we can add the modifier on a graphic which we actually just made. So you have to select your SVG renderer, and what's important is to select the SVG asset, and you have to enable this feature called use layers. If it's disabled, it will not work, as you can see. So you have to enable use layers, and this enables a function that it will completely change the way how it's rendered. So now it's not fully baked inside a mesh. Now it's baked in some specific format, which is able then to change its behavior. So when we changed the asset to use layers, we can now select the SVG renderer, and we can actually add the blur modifier. And as you can see, it already works, and now it's a constant blur in all directions, which can be used in some specific ways, like when you want to make something out of focus. But be aware that when you use a really large radius on that blur, it can yield in some artifacts. And when you want to use some directional blur, you can enable motion blur, and now you can specify the direction of the blur, which is useful, especially during animation. And when you want to use automatic direction based on the position of the camera or based on the motion of the object, you can use automatic motion blur. And now, as you can see, it's calculated in real time, but we have to lower the number for the radius. But as you can see right now, it looks really well, so it's much better, this effect, than without it. So when I turn it off, you can see there is no motion blur applied, and when it's turned on, now it's really blurry. even in the editor, which is really amazing, I think. So this was the demo with motion blur. Now we have an overlay texture demo, which is also useful. So don't forget that you have to have on the SVG asset enabled use layers before you can use any SVG modifier. And this one is called SVG UV modifier, and what this actually does is that it actually is providing us with some masking feature or a simple overlay. So you don't have to use it as a mask, but you can use it as an overlay texture. And as you can see, we have custom shader for this specific purpose, which we put a custom material in this asset. And now we can change through the UV modifier, we can change the position of our overlay, and also the rotation and scale, which is also useful. So this can be used for many effects, I think, and it's just as easy as selecting some kind of texture which you can use as an overlay. So you can actually use some noise on your vector graphics or some texture pattern paper or whatever you want, which I think is useful as well. So, and the last thing is that we can actually recolor individual layers, or basically every modifier which are part of SVG Importer, or you can make your own modifiers. It's fairly simple. When you look inside the script itself, you can see that you have to basically of course import the SVG Importer library, and then you have to extend from the SVG modifier. The class has to extend from the SVG modifier, and now there is only one function which you have to override, which is called prepare for rendering, and it gives you all the layers which you can work with, and it gives you also the SVG asset on which it's working, and if the user or the SVG importer wants to force update or automatic update. And this basically what it does is that it's changing the layers, so you can read these layers and you can modify them, and if you modify these layers, it will modify the output. That means that your graphics will look different, which is awesome, because it means that you can do whatever modifier you want. And when you want to select in the editor which layers have to use the modifier, you have to just turn on this toggle called use selection, and now it will use only the selected layer based on the SVG. Yeah, if I unselect it will recolor my whole SVG asset, and if I use the selection, it will recolor only the selection. And now what's interesting, I think, is how we can actually make the selection. It's simply as clicking this select button, and now as you can see we have the full list of the layers which we can select as this, and we will also see these individual layers in our viewport, which is useful as well. And if we want to click on a specific layer and select it, it is of course possible. So as you can see, this layer was selected, and if we want to select multiple layers, we will use keyboard modifiers. That means when holding Shift, I will select multiple layers, and when holding Alt, I will deselect these layers. So I think this is really useful, and you can do really interesting stuff with it. So we can also show a different, we can also use different modifiers together. That means that there don't have to be only one modifier, so we can use twirl modifier, and in the twirl modifier we have to assign some center, which can be some game object. Now we have to assign radius and intensity of the twirl effect. So as you can see now, it's doing the twirl as expected, and it's basically based on our target position, which makes it really easy to animate, even through animating. And when we want to select only specific layer, we use selection and select the specific layers which we want to modify, yeah, as in the first example. So we selected these layers, and now we are affecting only specific layers of our SVG asset. So I think this is basically enough, which should provide you enough information how to use SVG layers, which I personally think is extremely powerful feature, and it's easy to write your own modifiers. So see ya!